The night was meant to be ordinary. One more quiet evening in St. Mary Mead, where the most scandalous event of the week was Mrs. Pembroke's cat getting stuck in the vicar's tree. But ordinary nights have a way of unraveling, especially in places where secrets lurk behind lace curtains and polite smiles. At precisely 9:07 p.m., a flicker of commotion stirred the darkness along the narrow lane leading to Sinclair House. It began with a single hesitant light blinking on, then another. A murmur of voices followed, threading through the cold winter air like a ghostly whisper, and in the center of it all, one name passed from lip to lip in hushed, urgent tones. Sir Edmund Sinclair, the artist, the recluse. A man both admired and avoided. For years he had existed on the fringes of village life, present yet apart, his mind lost in the labyrinth of his own genius, his hands forever moving, painting, creating. Now it seemed, those hands would never move again. Constable Thomas Burrows was the first to enter the studio, a solid, practical man with a no-nonsense air. He had dealt with his fair share of village disturbances, an ill-tempered spaniel mauling the butcher's apron, a scandal involving misplaced ration books, but nothing like this. His boots crunched over shattered glass as he took a cautious step forward. The studio was a wreck. Candles had burned low in their holders, their weak flames casting frantic, flickering shadows across the walls. Half-finished canvases leaned against them in silent witness, their painted faces frozen in time. And in the center of it all, sprawled across the paint-splattered floor, was Sir Edmund Sinclair himself. His head rested at an unnatural angle, his spectacles lay cracked beside him, a pool of blood, dark and cruel in contrast to the bright hues of fallen paint, slowly spread beneath his body. Against the far wall an easel stood ominously, bearing an unfinished masterpiece. Burrows frowned. Even at a glance something about the painting was off. Unlike Sinclair's usual meticulous style, this one was wild, chaotic, strokes of vivid color clashing against one another in a frenzied dance. The more Burrows stared at it, the more unsettling it became. Had his hand faltered in his final moments? Had he been painting when death arrived? A movement at the door snapped him from his thoughts. One of Sinclair's house staff hovered there, pale and trembling. Burrows exhaled. "Fetch Inspector Davis." The lad bolted. Burrows took another step forward, careful not to disturb anything. The air was thick with the scent of oil paint, familiar, almost comforting, except now it mingled with something metallic. Blood. Death. A strange thing, he thought. How a place meant for creation could so quickly become a scene of absolute destruction. His gaze swept the room. There were signs of struggle, a toppled chair, a vase shattered near the window, but something was wrong. A burglary. That would be the simple explanation. The tragic, unfortunate sort of thing that people could shake their heads over at the tea shop the next morning. And yet, Burrows frowned. If the motive had been theft, why had nothing of value been taken? Not a single painting was missing. The brushes and palettes were scattered but untouched. Everything was in disarray, yet nothing had actually been stolen. Except, perhaps, a life. A shadow fell across the threshold. Inspector Davis had arrived. A man of weary patience, Davis carried the air of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by the affairs of the human heart. He removed his gloves with the slow, practiced movements of a man who had seen too many bodies, too many bloodstains, too many rooms like this one. "A burglary gone wrong?" he asked, his voice even. Burrows hesitated. "Perhaps, sir, but," he gestured vaguely to the room, "it doesn't sit quite right." Davis sighed, glancing at the body, then the easel. "It never does, and yet people insist on making it so." The room fell into silence, save for the soft ticking of the clock on the mantel. And then, a voice, quiet but certain, cut through the hush. "Perhaps," the voice said, measured and deliberate, "that is because this is not a burglary at all." Both men turned sharply. There, standing in the doorway, dressed impeccably, despite the lateness of the hour, eyes sharp as steel, was Miss Jane Marple, and she was already seeing things they could not. Ever-practical tweed coat stood Miss Agatha Marple. Her expression was thoughtful, her keen blue eyes taking in the room, with a quiet intelligence that would have been easy to overlook, had one been foolish enough to do so. "How fortunate," she continued, stepping lightly over the threshold, "that I happened to be passing by." And so it began. The night air hung thick with whispers from the narrow lanes of St. Mary, me to the firearm corners of the Rose and Thorn Inn. The name of Sir Edmund Sinclair flitted from lip to lip like a scandalous melody. The village had known tragedy before, of the quiet respectable sort, an influenza taking poor old Mrs. Bellamy, a farm hand's unfortunate tumble into the river, but murder that was altogether different. The grand residence of Sinclair House with its ivy clay facade and tall imposing windows now loomed over the village like a spectre, its once war glow extinguished by death. Inside the work of law and order was underway. Inspector Davis stood over the cluttered writing desk, his brow furrowed. "What do you make of this, Bars?" Constable Bars, less inclined to intellectual pursuits than his superior, peered over his shoulder. Laid out before them, amidst half-used tubes of paint and crumpled rags, were 3 sheets of paper, each bearing a crypt sketch. The first depicted a crude, exaggerated figure of a man in a top hat, his face contorted in an unnatural, almost grotesque grin. The second, more abstract, was a series of interlocking triangles forming what could have been an elaborate puzzle, or mere artistic whimsy. But the third was the most unsettling. It was an unfinished portrait, not of Sir Edmund, but of someone else, someone who, had they been rendered in full, might have been recognizable. The half-drawn eyes, however, seemed to follow the room's occupants with unsettling scrutiny. Barrow exhaled. "Well, sir, I'd say the man had strange tastes." David didn't answer. Immediately instead, he picked up another piece of paper, a hastily written note, its ink slightly smudged. The words, while few, were clear enough. It must be finished before, for the unveiling. No more mistakes. Davis muttered under his breath. "What unveiling?" Burrow scratched the back of his head. "That festival's coming up, isn't it? Maybe it's about that." Maybe. Davis tapped the note against his palm. Thoughtfully, outside the house, a different kind of investigation was underway. One led not by law, but by the unshakable force of village curiosity. Mrs. Lydia Harper, a woman who prided herself on knowing everything before anyone else, stood at the gate, with arms crossed and eyes sharp. "Well, I always said he was an odd one. Locked himself away for days on end, didn't he? And that muse of his, what was her name? Caroline. Too pretty. But, if you ask me, always hovering about at the muse they called her." Mrs. Pettigrew, a thin, nervous-looking woman, sniffed disapprovingly. "A dangerous thing. If you ask me, poets and painters always making trouble. Why, my own cousin in Brighton took up with a sculptor and lost all sense of herself, ended up selling her good china just to keep up with the nonsense. A burglary. They say." Mr. Curtis, the postmaster, leaned in conspiratorially. "I hear the window was broken clean through. Whoever did it must have been after something valuable." Mrs. Harper scoffed. "Valuable? What, a painting?" "No, Mr. Curtis, I dare say this was something more sinister. And if you want my opinion, not particularly," came a muffled voice behind them. The trio turned, startled to find Miss Agatha Marple standing a few paces away. She had been listening, of course, with all the quiet discretion of a cat. At the hearth, Mrs. Harper recovered. "First, Miss Marple, you do have a habit of appearing at the most curious moment." Miss Marple, in her sensible tweed coat, smiled plump and lit. "But one must always pay attention to curious moments. Don't you think they so often contain useful things?" Mrs. Pettigrew, eager for the latest. Morel leaned in. "You don't suppose it's true what they say about a secret society? Sir Edmund was involved." "Yes." Miss Morel folded her gloved hands. "The Midnight Order, I believe. Or was it the Society of the Three Crowns?" Mrs. Harper scoffed. "Nonsense. All of it. A man like Sinclair didn't need secret handshakes to get into trouble. He did well enough on his own." Miss Marple merely smiled. "Back inside," exhaled, rubbing his temple. "It doesn't add up. Boris, if it was a burglar, why leave the silver untouched? And why did Sinclair have these strange drawings scattered about? And more importantly," he glanced at the easel where half-finished painting loomed like an accusation. "What was he trying to finish?" Boris, sensing the rising headache in his superior, wisely refrained from answering. From the hallway, the soft click of a heel against tile announced a presence. Miss Marple entered with the polite serenity of a woman arriving for tea. Inspector, she greeted mildly, her sharp blue eyes already scanning the room. What a terrible thing. Quite unsettling, isn't it? Davis, who had long ago learned that Miss Marple's presence was rarely incidental, sigh indeed. She stepped lightly toward the desk, peering at the cryptic sketches with quiet curiosity, and yet she murmured, almost to herself, I find that things which unsettle us are often those which, when examined closely, make the most sense. Davis regarded her wearily. You have a theory already, Miss Marple. She offered a mild smile. Goodness, no one mustn't jump to conclusions, but I do think, she added, tapping a gloved finger against her chin, that I should very much like to speak with Miss Caroline Davis. Frowned Caroline Gray. His muse, Miss Marple nodded. It occurs to me that inspiration can be a rather dangerous thing, and love, she turned, glancing at the unfinished portrait, even more so. And with that she turned toward the door, leaving behind mind an inspector who had the distinct weary feeling that she had already begun solving his case. It was a peculiar thing, Miss Marple thought, how grief could take so many shapes. Some wore it like a badge, some carried it in silence, and others, well, others had a way of performing it. Miss Caroline Gray was neither theatrical nor withdrawn. She sat in the parlor of Sinclair House, poised like a painted figure, come to life, composed, yet seriously hollow. The room itself spoke in hushed tones of its former master. A fireplace stood cold and unlit, the air thick with a faint tang of turpentine, and old parchment everywhere. There were relics of Sir Edmund's life, a cluster of sketchbooks curling at the edges, a half-drunk cup of tea left on a side table, its contents long since turned an unappetizing shade, and there above the mantel was a portrait, one of the few completed works Sir Edmund had been known to keep for himself. It was of a woman, though not in the traditional sense. The strokes were bold, unapologetic, the colors rich with warmth, but cut through with a kind of longing. One did not need to ask who had sat for it. Caroline's gaze lingered on the painting before shifting to Miss Marple with the same slow deliberation. I suppose you've come to ask about him, she said, her voice low. Measured Miss Marple, seated opposite her, folded her hands primly in her lap. Naturally, dear, a terrible thing is passing. It must have been quite a shock. Caroline exhaled, tilting her chin slightly, gesture that could have signaled either dignity or restraint. I don't think it's quite sunk in yet, she admitted. I keep expecting him to call for me. He never could find his own spectacles. You know, there was something in her tone, an effortlessness, a familiarity that lingered just beyond propriety. Miss Marple gave a small thoughtful nod. You knew him well. Then a faint smile ghosted Caroline's lips, as well as anyone could. I suppose Edmund was singular, impossible at times, but brilliant. Her fingers traced absent patterns along the edge of the armrest. He lived for his work, for his art. It was the only thing that truly mattered to him. Miss Marple's eyes, keen as a need, missed nothing. The only thing. Caroline's fingers stilled for the first time. Her expression flickered, a crack in the otherwise perfect veneer. It was a moment quickly mended, but not before Miss Marple had neatly tucked the observation away in the folds of her mind. I mean only that he was consumed by it, Caroline said, smoothing the fabric of her dress with unnecessary precision. It was his greatest love. Ah, Miss Marple murmured, that is often the way with men of genius, isn't it? Passionate about their craft, often to the exclusion of all else. It must have been difficult, at times, being his muse. Caroline let out a soft laugh, though it held little humor. A muse, that's what they called me, as if I were some ethereal creature conjured for his convenience. Were you not? The question was posed gently, but it landed like a carefully placed stone in still water. Caroline's eyes darkened, her grip tightening ever so slightly on the armrest. I was more than that, she said, the words quiet, but edged with something brittle. I wasn't just inspiration, I was part of his life. Miss Marple inclined her head, watching as Caroline turned her face away, staring once more at the portrait above the mantel. There was grief in her expression. Yes, But there was something else, too. Something that to the untrained eye might have been mistaken for sorrow alone. Miss Marple, however, was very well trained indeed. After a moment, she rose, adjusting the cuff of her sleeve. "Memories are curious things," she said, her voice light. "One can't help but wonder how much of them belong to us, and how much we invent to make sense of things." Caroline glanced at her. "And what do you mean by that, Miss Marple?" "Only that the mind is a clever thing," Miss Marple replied with a mind. "Miss Marple, it protects us from what we do not wish to see, and sometimes it shapes the past into something rather more beautiful than it truly was." She reached for her gloves, slipping them on with practiced ease. "Thank you, dear. You've been very helpful. I shan't take up any more of your time." Caroline hesitated, her lips parting as if to say something else, but whatever it was, she thought better of it. Instead, she gave a slight nod. "If you need anything else, I expect I shall," Miss Marple assured her, her tone breezy. As ever, a murder has such a way of turning up the most fascinating little details. With that, she took her leave, stepping back into the cool evening air of St. Mary Me, where the whispers of the village still drifted through the streets like smoke curling from the chimneys. The case had begun in earnest now, and Miss Marple, for all her assuming ways, had already seen what needed seeing. The question now was simple. Had Caroline Gray truly loved Sir Edmund Sinclair, or had she simply wished to possess him? The air in St. Mary Me carried a distinct chill that evening, a creeping dampness that settled into the cobblestones and clung to the hedge. Marple walked home at an unhurried pace, her mind whirring with the quiet precision of a well-kept timepiece. She had seen many things in her lifetime: scandals concealed behind lace curtains, whispered betrayals exchanged over garden fences. But love, or rather the illusion of it, was the most dangerous thing of all. Caroline Gray had loved Sir Edmund Sinclair, that much was evident. But love, Miss Marple mused, was often a many-sided thing, and not always returned in the way one hoped. In St. Mary Me few things remained private for long. By the time Miss Marple had removed her gloves and set the kettle to boil, the matter of Sir Edmund's tragic demise had been dissected and speculated upon in nearly every household at the Rose and Thorn Inn, where portly Mr. Griggs wiped glasses with the solemnity of a priest at confession. The conversation had taken a rather dramatic turn. "I tell you she adored him," declared Mrs. Pettigrew, leaning forward, her voice hushed with the thrill of revelation. "Saw it with my own eyes. I did. The way she looked at him. Well, it was enough to make you blush." "Unfortunate business," that muttered Mr. Curtis, who had spent 3 decades sorting post, and had come to believe that most human tragedies could be traced back to the sending, or not sending, of letters. "A woman like that pining away never ends." "Well, Mrs. Harper, ever the authority on village." Intrigue tapped her teaspoon against her saucer. "She was devoted, no doubt about it, but mark my words, gentlemen, devotion can be a dreadful thing, especially when it goes unanswered." There was a murmur of agreement. The village knew its share of tragedies, and one of the oldest stories in the world was that of a woman scorned. Miss Marple, never one to dismiss a valuable tidbit of gossip, reflected on what she had gathered over the years. She recalled seeing Caroline and Sir Edmund together at the summer fete. Some months prior, Caroline had hovered near him, close enough that one might have assumed her presence was essential, yet he had barely acknowledged her. His attentions had been elsewhere, flitting between patrons and fellow artists, charming and engaged in his element. Caroline, Miss Marple had noted at the time, had watched him with an intensity that suggested both pride and quiet suffering. There had been a moment so small as to be almost imperceptible when Sir Edmund had turned away, mid-conversation, leaving her standing, hand half raised, as if reaching for something that had already slipped away. And then there was that incident at the garden party. Miss Marple had overheard snippets of a conversation between Caroline and another woman, Lady Audley. If she recalled correctly, it must be quite exhausting, Lady Audley had remarked, always being, as what do they call it, his muse. "It isn't exhausting," Caroline had replied, a tightness in her tone. "It's what I was meant for, and yet he doesn't seem the sort to. He needs me. There had been something brittle in the way she had said it, a conviction, laced with desperation. Sitting in her parlor, Miss Marple ran her fingers lightly over the small notepad she kept for moments such as these. She jotted down the words carefully. Caroline, admiration or possession. There were women who loved, and there were women who needed to be loved. The latter, Miss Marple had found, were far more dangerous. What if Caroline had sensed in those final days that she was losing him? Sir Edmund had been a man of impulses, but he had also been secretive. What had he been painting in those last hours? What message had he left unfinished? Miss Marple sighed, tapping her pen against her chin. The festival, of course, would bring matters to a head. It always did. The unveiling of his final work was meant to be a tribute. Now it would be something else entirely, a reckoning. Few things stirred the village of St. Mary, me quite like a public event, and the annual art festival had always been a highlight of the season. But this year it was something else entirely, a festival in honor of a man freshly murdered. Had a certain morbid allure. The tragedy of Sir Edmund Sinclair's untimely demise had draped the event in an air of suspense, and the villagers, practical though they were, could not help but revel in the intrigue. The town square was alive with movement. Stalls were being arranged with all the fuss and clatter of a well-practiced performance. Banners in deep crimson and gold were strung between lampposts, fluttering in the chill autumn breeze. Artists, some local, some from the city, worked diligently to arrange their exhibits under the watchful eyes of an ever-growing crowd. But it was the final unveiling of Sir Edmund's last unfinished painting that had captured everyone's imagination. "It's ghastly, if you ask me," muttered Mrs. Pettigrew, adjusting her gloves as she peered at a nearby easel, putting a dead man's work on display, and in such a public fashion. "It's indecent." Mrs. Harper, adjusting her hat to a more flattering angle, pursed her lips. "Oh, come now. A bit of tragedy never hurt an exhibition. If anything, it's made the festival rather fashionable, hasn't it? London critics are even coming down for it. And what's that phrase they use in those ghastly American pictures? The show must go on." Nearby, Mr. Curtis, the postmaster, leaned in conspiratorially. "They say the painting's cursed. You know, a bad omen having it unveiled like this. And between you and me," he lowered his voice, though not quite enough, "some folk are whispering that it was all over that rich canvas that someone didn't want it seen." "Well, if that's the case," sniffed Mrs. Harper, "they ought to have done a better job, because the whole town will be looking at it tomorrow evening." Crowd hummed with similar murmurings, speculation thick in the air. Even those who did not normally concern themselves with art had suddenly found themselves interested in the late Sir Edmund's final creation, and standing a little apart from it all, observing with quiet intensity, was Miss Marple. It was a skill of Miss Marple, one she had cultivated over many years, to appear as though she were simply there, no more remarkable than a garden shrub or an embroidered footstool. But she missed very little. She noted the hurried, whispered exchanges between exhibitors, the flickers of unease in certain expressions. The festival, intended as a celebration, carried a far heavier mood than anticipated. More importantly, she noted Caroline's absence. A woman so devoted to Sir Edmund, so entwined with his artistic world. Surely she would wish to be part of the event, unless of course she had something more pressing to concern herself with. Miss Marple's gaze swept the square, pausing briefly on the imposing facade of the town hall, where the final unveiling would take place. If someone had indeed killed Sir Edmund over that painting, then the festival's conclusion would be the perfect moment for the truth to come to light. A reckoning was coming, and as she quietly observed the village, the excitement, the tension in the air, Miss Marple knew one thing for certain: whatever had begun with Sir Edmund's murder was far from over. Sir Mary, for all its charm, had an uncanny way of brewing secrets beneath its quiet surface. By now the village was a bubbling cauldron of speculation, the upcoming art festival having transformed into something more than a mere cultural event, with Sedman's in sudden and violent end. The unveiling of his final painting was no longer about art, it was about truth, and Miss Marple suspected someone was quite desperate to keep that truth buried. It was just past noon when the anonymous note arrived. Miss Marple had been seated at her usual spot in the tea room of the Rose and Thorn, nursing a cup of weak chamomile and listening to the chatter around her with the air of a woman who had no particular business at all. The note was delivered discreetly left upon her table when she wasn't looking, tucked neatly beneath the sugar bowl. She retrieved it with mild curiosity, unfolded the small square of parchment, and read another will fall before the unveiling. A second accident, if you do not stop it tonight. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes flickered, but otherwise her expression did not change. She reached for her teaspoon and stirred her tea with slow, deliberate movements. It was the sort of message that RA of melodrama, but one did not discount such things too quickly, not when murder had already made its presence known across the room. Mrs. Harper and Mrs. Pettigrew were engaged in hushed conversation, their words accompanied by the occasional conspiratorial glance. Miss Marple caught fragments. Caroline hasn't been seen all morning. He seemed most unsettled when I spoke to him yesterday. Now that was interesting. Mr. Alfred Levington was one of the artists set to exhibit at the festival, a man of middling talent, though of some reputation in artistic circles. More importantly, he had been one of the few who had worked closely with Sir Edmund in his final weeks. If someone wished to silence a witness before the unveiling, he would be a logical target. Miss Marple folded the note and slipped it into her handbag. There was work to be done by mid-afternoon. The village square had become a scene of organized chaos. Carpenters hammered last-minute adjustments to the stage where Sir Edmund's painting would be revealed. Vendors arranged their wars and clusters of artists debated fiercely over whose work would garner the most attention. Amid the bustle, Miss Marple moved with quiet purpose. She found Mr. Levington in the side room of the town hall where he had been setting up his exhibit, a series of uninspired landscapes that spoke more of commercial ambition than artistic vision. The man himself, however, was in a state of agitation, his normally impeccable attire pinstriped, waistcoat well-pressed, trousers were slightly disheveled, and his hands trembled as he adjusted the placement of his frames. Mr. Levington, Miss Marple greeted her voice light. I do hope I'm not intruding. Levington turned sharply, blinking as though he had not fully registered her presence. Miss Marple, no, not at all, just a bit distracted. I imagine the festival must be quite the strain, especially under such tragic circumstances. Yes, of course, he murmured, but there was something in his demeanor and unease that went beyond the usual nerves of an artist before a showing. Miss Marple studied him with curiosity. It must have been difficult losing Sir Edmund so suddenly. You were close, were you not? Levington hesitated. Well, I wouldn't say close. We collaborated, discussed ideas, techniques, but he was an unpredictable man. Genius often is indeed, Miss Marple agreed. And yet I wonder, have you noticed anything unusual in the past few days? Anything that struck you as odd? The question was innocent enough, but it seemed to unsettle him further. He reached into his pocket, withdrawing a case, and extracting a cigarette with slightly unsteady fingers. Unusual, he gave a short humorous laugh. Everything about this festival is unusual. Half the town is convinced his painting will reveal some great secret, as if art works that way. Miss Marple smiled politely. Perhaps not, but secrets do have a way of finding their way into unexpected places. Levington did not reply. Instead, he exhaled a thin stream of smoke, his gaze drifting toward the covered easel, where Sir Edmund's painting awaited its grand reveal. Miss Marple took her leave shortly after, but not before making note of something rather peculiar. Levington was afraid, and that she thought as she walked back into the bustling square was most intriguing indeed. As evening drew closer, tension settled over St. Mary. Not overt, but tangible all the same. There was an undercurrent of expectation, a sense that some was about to happen. Miss Marple sat at her small writing desk, reviewing the pieces of the puzzle thus far. Sir Edmund Sinclair was dead. His final painting, unfinished, was to be unveiled at the festival. Caroline Gray had been curiously absent. A woman in mourning or a woman avoiding scrutiny? Mr. Lavington was anxious. Had he seen something, knew something, or was he afraid of something yet to come? And now an anonymous warning. A second accident. Unless she prevented it, she tapped her pen thoughtfully against the page. The festival was set to begin in mere hours. If someone intended to strike again, it would be soon. Miss Marple folded her notes neatly, placed them back into her drawer and reached for her coat. Time was running out, and she intended to be ahead of it. Sir Edmund Sinclair's studio had the air of a place abandoned mid-thought. The room was untouched since the night of his murder save for the faint traces left by the constabulary. Chalk, outlines, dust, disturbed where careful hands had catalogued evidence. A single fingerprint, smudged in the drying varnish of a half-finished canvas. Miss Marple stood in the doorway, taking it all in with a quiet, practiced gaze. The heavy scent of oil paint and turpentine lingered in the air, mingling with the faintest trace of something metallic. Blood. Memory. The constables had done their work efficiently, but it was a well-known fact that policemen, for all their diligence, often lacked imagination. They saw what was there. Miss Marple had always been far more interested in what was not. She stepped inside, moving carefully. The walls were lined with canvases, some shrouded in dust sheets, others half-exposed glimpses of Sir Edmund's restless mind. But it was the desk that held her attention. It was cluttered, but not in a careless way. Letters were stacked haphazardly, as though they had been rifled through in search of something. A leather-bound journal lay half-open, pages smudged where a careless. Miss Marple spread the sketches carefully across the desk, the brittle pages whispering beneath her fingers. At first glance, they were nonsense, chaotic, unfinished figures, jagged lines crisscrossing in what seemed like random patterns. But repetition was a curious thing. A man does not sketch the same symbols over and over unless they mean something. One symbol in particular appeared again and again. 3 interlocking circles, each containing a distinct mark, a key, a dagger, and an eye. Miss Marple's lips pursed. She had heard whispers before, of course. Sir Edmund had always been a man of influence, his talents admired far beyond the quiet hedgerows of St. Mary Myth. But admiration and trust were not the same thing. His patrons were not merely lovers of fine art, they were collectors, and collectors, especially those who treated art as currency, as power, rarely kept their hands clean. Her fingers moved lightly to the diary beside the sketches. The ink was smudged in places, some words deliberately scratched out in a hurried, anxious hand, but a careful eye could still trace the skeleton of meaning beneath the chaos. Meeting postponed. They suspect. Must be careful. See, growing impatient. Promises cannot keep forever. Unveiling will change everything. Miss Marple's frown Unveiling? Of what? A painting, a secret, something worth killing for. And then, tucked between the pages, she found something most curious. A map. It was roughly drawn, more impressionistic than precise, but the locations were clear. St. Mary Mead, the town square, the festival hall, and then, marked with a small deliberate X, was the very studio where she stood. A chill crept along Miss Marple's spine. Sir Edmund had been keeping secrets, but the most pressing question was not what he'd known. It was who had silenced him to keep it buried. And perhaps more importantly, who would be next. With the same quiet precision, she folded the map neatly, and slipped it into her handbag. It was time for a few conversations. The candlelight cast long, flickering shadows along the drawing-room walls of Caroline Gray's cottage. It was an intimate sort of glow, one that softened the harsh edges of the room, and bathed everything in a muted golden haze. The scent of wax mingled faintly with something floral, jasmine, perhaps lingering, from an old perfume, or dried petals forgotten in a dish. Miss Marple took in the scene with mild interest. Caroline sat opposite her, perched on the edge of an overstuffed armchair, her slender hands folded carefully in her lap. She had the look of a woman worn thin. Shadows clung beneath, her eyes betraying either grief or sleeplessness, perhaps both. Between them the silence stretched. Unspoken words settled like dust in the corners of the room. "How kind of you to call, Miss Marple," Caroline said at last. The words were polite, but the tone suggested she found the visit anything but. "Oh, not at all, dear," Miss Marple replied, smoothing the fabric of her skirt with practiced ease. "One can't help but feel that in these dreadful circumstances, it's important to check on old friends." Caroline let out a soft, brittle laugh. I didn't think we were friends. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. No, I suppose not, but I do think we both knew Sir Edmund rather well, and in times of grief, it helps to talk. For the briefest moment, Caroline's fingers twitched, a small reaction, but telling nonetheless. And what exactly is it that you'd like to talk about? She asked, her voice carefully controlled. Miss Marple tilted her head, as if considering, oh, just little things. His work, for instance. Did you know he kept sketches, pages and pages of them, filled with strange little symbols? Caroline's posture remained rigid, but something flickered behind her eyes. Miss Marple continued, her tone light. And then, of course, there's the diary. It seems Sir Edmund was waiting for something, or someone. Would you happen to know what that was? Caroline's fingers tightened in her lap. Miss Marple observed her reaction the way a bird watcher observes a restless sparrow, with quiet patience. Caroline let out a slow breath, her expression unreadable. Sir Edmund was a complicated man. Oh, quite, Miss Marple agreed. But not, I think, without his reasons. A silence settled between them once more, but this time it was heavier, charged. Miss Marple took a delicate sip of her tea. She would get to the truth. She always did. As why you were so very absent during the festival preparations. It must have been difficult, of course, knowing that Sir Edmund's final work was to be displayed, but I should have thought you'd want to be involved. Caroline exhaled sharply through her nose. I had no interest in standing about, while people gawped at his work like scavengers over a carcass. A rather strong image, Miss Marple noted mildly, but an understandable sentiment. And yet one wonders if you were so indifferent. Why did you go back to the studio the night before he died? Caroline's gaze snapped to her sharp and startled for a fraction of a second. Her mask slipped, and there just beneath the surface was something Miss Marple had expected to find: panic. Caroline recovered quickly, but it was too late. I don't know what you mean, she said, her voice carefully. Even Miss Marple sighed, leaning back ever so slightly. Oh, I do think you do, dear. The constables, you see, are very good at cataloguing evidence, but not always so clever at interpretation. A smudge on the floor means nothing to them. A stray hair, a misplaced brush, insignificant, unless one understands the story they tell. Caroline swallowed. And what story do you think they tell, Miss Marple? That you were there, Miss Marple said gently, and that you had a reason for being there. Caroline let out a sharp breath. Standing abruptly, she paced to the fireplace, resting a hand against the mantel. The flickering candle light caught in her hair, turning it to liquid copper. Yes, she admitted at last. Voice. I went to the studio that night. I wanted to see him, but I didn't kill him, if that's what you're implying. Miss Marple clasped her hands together, unbothered by the defensiveness in Caroline's tone. No, I don't believe you did. Caroline turned to her, startled. You don't, not at night. Miss Marple clarified. But you were angry, weren't you? I'm afraid Sir Edmund was hiding something, and you suspected it had to do with you. Caroline's lips parted slightly, but no words came. Miss Marple continued, her voice as soft as the flickering light between them. You weren't just his muse, dear. You were part of something much larger. Weren't you? Something you may not have fully understood. The color drained from Caroline's face. Miss Marple watched her carefully, noting the way her breathing had quickened. Caroline shook her head, as if trying to clear it. You don't understand. I loved him, Miss Marple murmured. But did he love you? Caroline flinched as if struck. The room fell silent outside. The wind stirred the branches of the trees, tapping them against the window pane like restless fingers. Miss Marple rose from her chair, smoothing her gloves with deliberate care. I think we both know, she said, that the unveiling of his final painting will answer a great many questions. The only thing left to determine is whether we shall have another tragedy. Before then, she turned towards the door, pausing just long enough to glance back at Caroline, who stood frozen by the hearth, her eyes dark with something unreadable. Take care, dear, Miss Marple said softly. I fear this story is not yet finished." And with that she stepped out into the night, leaving Caroline alone in the flickering glow of candlelight where secrets still lurked in the shadows. By the time Miss Marple returned to her cottage, she had made up her mind. Caroline was hiding something. Whether it was fear or guilt remained to be seen. But one thing was clear. Whatever Sir Edmund had known, whatever he had painted was dangerous enough to kill for. And if she was right, then the true culprit would not let the unveiling go unanswered. Miss Marple sat down her handbag and took out her small notepad with careful precision. She wrote down a single line: "The painting will reveal the truth. These but will they let it be seen." She tapped her pen against the page, then reached for the telephone. It was time to set a trap, and she very much hoped the killer would walk straight into it. The fire in Miss Marple's sitting room crackled softly, sending warm flickers of light across the walls where delicate china plates and framed cross-stitch samplers spoke of a quiet, respectable life. It was a room of comfort and calm, but tonight it served as a war room. A large cork board usually reserved for reminders about the Women's Institute meetings, and the occasional shopping list had been transformed into something altogether different. Pinned to it were newspaper clippings, scribbled notes and hastily copied sketches from Sir Edmund Sinclair's studio. A thick red string ran between key points connecting events in a web of intrigue at the center of it all. The painting Miss Marple stood before it, her sharp blue eyes flicking over the assembled clues, noting connections that had previously been obscured by the fog of misdirection. The ticking of the antique carriage clock on the mantel filled the silence, a steady, relentless sound, reminding her that time was running out. She reached for a pencil and began to map out the timeline once more, muttering softly to herself. As she worked 3 nights ago, Sir Edmund Sinclair was murdered in his studio, seemingly in the midst of painting something significant. The room was disturbed, yet nothing valuable was taken, suggesting the crime was personal, not opportunistic. The next morning, Caroline Gray was curiously absent from the public eye when questioned. She admitted to having visited the studio that night, but denied any involvement in the murder. Her grief was genuine, yet her evasiveness suggested there was more. She was not saying the festival preparations. Whispers of Sir Edmund's final work had spread through the village, fueling speculation and unease. Certain individuals, Mr. Lavington, the nervous artist Mrs. Harper, the village gossip, even Inspector Davis himself, had exhibited varying degrees of discomfort when discussing the painting. The anonymous note, a warning, had reached Miss Marple, hinting that another crime would take place before the unveiling. Someone was desperate to prevent that painting from being seen. The symbols and the secret society. The sketches in Sir Edmund's study had included cryptic markings, 3 interlocking circles with a key, a dagger, and an eye. A symbol of power, of hidden influence. Had Sir Edmund been blackmailing someone? Or had he simply known too much? She tapped her pencil against the paper. What was in that painting? Whatever it was, someone had been willing to kill for it, and now they were preparing to kill again. Miss Marple turned away from the board and moved to her writing desk, reaching for a fresh sheet of note paper with steady precision. She composed a short message, folded it neatly, and placed it into an envelope. Then she picked up the telephone receiver and dialed. After a few rings, a voice answered, formal, brisk. "This is Inspector Davis. Good evening." "Inspector," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle yet firm. "I do believe we must speak before the festival begins. There is a great deal at stake, and I should rather prefer we prevent another unfortunate occurrence." There was a pause on the other end, followed by the sound of a chair scraping against the floor. "What have you found?" "A great many things," Miss Marple replied, "but more importantly, I have a plan. I do believe our murderer will make a move tonight." The carriage clock struck the hour, its chime clear and crisp in the quiet room. Time was slipping away and the final act was about to begin. The telephone jangled loudly in Miss Marple's quiet sitting room, breaking the calm like a stone cast into still water. She had been expecting it in a way. Trouble had a tendency to arrive with inconvenient urgency. She lifted the receiver with her usual politeness. Miss Marple speaking. The voice on the other end was breathless, near frantic. "Miss Marple, It's awful. There's been a disturbance near the festival hall. Someone tried to Now Miss Marple interrupted gently. The grip on the receiver tightened. Take a breath, dear. Who is speaking? Florence, came the hurried reply. Florence Travellan from the gallery committee. I was just arriving to check the exhibition space when I heard shouting. I think someone was attacked. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Where exactly? The east side of the square near Mr. Lavington. Exhibit Mr. Lavington, the anxious artist, the man who had worked closely with Sir Edmund, and who just hours ago had seemed profoundly unsettled. Miss Marple did not waste time with further pleasantries. Stay where you are, Florence. I shall be along directly. By the time Miss Marple arrived at the festival hall, the square was already abuzz. A small crowd had gathered outside the exhibition space, voices raised and excited speculation. Some indulging in theatrical gasps for effect. Lanterns swung from their posts, casting jittery pools of light across the cobblestone. The center of attention was a disheveled Mr. Lavington, who stood pale and shaken near the entrance, his hands trembling as he attempted to brush dust from his lapels. His normally neat attire was askew, and a long streak of dirt marred his sleeve. Inspector Davis was already on the scene, his expression grim as he questioned one of the bystanders. Upon seeing Miss Marple approach, he gave her a look of weary resignation. I assume you heard one. Does try to keep abreast of such things, she said mildly, her eyes already sweeping the scene. What happened, Davis? Sighed Lincoln here. Claims someone attempted to push him down the stairs leading into the side. Gallery says he heard a noise behind him, turned just in time to see a shadow, and the next thing he knew, he was stumbling forward. Miss Marple's gaze flicked toward the gallery's entrance, an old stone building with narrow stairs leading up to a secondary exhibition room. The fall wouldn't have killed him outright, but at the very least it would have left him badly injured. Lavington cleared his throat. I tell you, someone meant to silence me. He was clearly shaken, though there was something else beneath his nerves, resentment, perhaps, or fear. And why? Miss Marple asked. Should someone wish to do that? Mr. Lavington, the artist, swallowed, avoiding her gaze. Well, I don't know. A murmur passed through the crowd. Miss Marple caught snippets. Someone doesn't want that painting seen, and it's all about Sinclair's last work. You mark my words. Tell me, Mr. Lincoln, Miss Marple said, her voice light. What exactly was it that you were about to do when this unfortunate accident occurred? He hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he admitted, I was going to check on the security of the painting Sinclair's. Miss Marple exchanged a look with Inspector Davis. So that was it. Someone growing more desperate by the hour was willing to risk everything to prevent Sir Edmund's final work from being unveiled. And if they had tried to attack Lavington now so publicly, then their patience was at an end. The true danger was only just beginning. As the crowd began to disperse, Miss Marple turned to Inspector Davis, lowering her voice. Whoever is behind this has no intention of allowing that painting to be shown tomorrow. Davis frowned. You think they'll make another attempt? I rather think, Miss Marple, said her voice quiet, but firm, that if we don't stop them tonight, there may be no unveiling at all. She straightened her hat, then added almost as an afterthought, which means, my dear Inspector, we must set a rather clever little trap. And with that she walked briskly toward the festival hall, leaving Davis to follow with the sinking realization that Miss Marple had once again taken matters firmly into her own hands. The great hall of Ravenscroft Manor was a place of grandeur, though its faded tapestries and dust-laden chandeliers spoke of a past more opulent than its present. The storm outside clawed at the tall windows, lightning flaring intermittently to cast jagged shadows against the walls at the center of the hall. In the dim glow of the candelabras, Caroline Gray stood alone. She had the air of a woman who had been running from something, though whether it was pursuit or the weight of her own actions was yet to be determined. She was pale, her auburn hair slightly disheveled, her usual poise diminished by something raw and unsettled in her eyes. Miss Marple entered quietly, her step unhurried, but deliberate. Inspector Davis followed, his expression impassive. though his presence, solid and expectant, sealed the room like a locked door. There would be no escape. Caroline did not turn to greet them. Instead, she kept her gaze fixed on the empty fireplace, hands clasped tightly in front of her, as they were bracing against a wind that had yet to come. Miss Marple spoke first. "My dear," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "you really must stop running." Caroline let out a short, brittle laugh, shaking her head. "Running? What nonsense! I've done nothing of the sort." Miss Marple, sharp blue eyes softened. "Ah, but you have, and you must be terribly tired of it by now." A pause, a flicker of something across Caroline's face, something close to recognition, or perhaps resignation. Miss Marple took a step forward. "We know you were in the studio the night Sir Edmund was killed. That much was clear from the beginning. You said you went to see him, and I believe you, but I do wonder, my dear, what exactly you saw." Caroline stiffened. "I already told you." Yes, Miss Marple interrupted lightly. "You told us you left that he was alive when you walked away. Oh. And yet your words have always carried the weight of something left unsaid." Caroline's hands curled into fists. "And what is it you think I left unsaid?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Considering perhaps the part where you realized he was never going to love you the way you loved him." Silence. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm flickering light over Caroline's face that was no longer composed, no longer careful. Caroline exhaled a shuddering breath that betrayed the weight of what she carried. "I gave him everything," she whispered, I read more to herself than to them. "I devoted my life to him, to his work, his art," he said. "I was his muse, that I inspired him." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And yet inspiration is not the same as love." Strangled sound escaped Caroline's lips. "No," she admitted, "it is not." Her shoulders trembled, as the full truth, unspoken for too long, began to rise to the surface. I thought, if I could just be patient, if I could just prove that I was indispensable, he would see me," she said, her voice cracking. "But he never did. He was too wrapped up in his own world." And then she faltered, as though the next words would undo her completely. Miss Marple's voice was quiet, but insistent. "And then you learned about him." Caroline's breath caught. Her eyes snapped to Miss Marple, filled with something raw and jagged. "Og." "Yes," Miss Marple continued. "You weren't his muse, my dear. You were his shadow. The one he used, leaned on, but never truly saw. And when you finally realized that someone else had captured his heart, someone who was not you, you were faced with a terrible choice. Weren't you?" Caroline let out a sob, her hands flying to cover her mouth. "I didn't mean to." Her knees buckled slightly, and she clutched the back of a chair, as though it were the only thing keeping her upright. "He told me it was nothing," she choked out. "I'm swear it, but I saw it. I knew it, the way he spoke about her, the way he painted her." Miss Marple stepped forward. "And in your jealousy, in your grief, you lashed out." Caroline's lips trembled. "I didn't mean to kill him." The words hung in the air, heavy, damning. Davis straightened beside Miss Marple, his posture that of a man who had just received the confession he had been waiting for, but Miss Marple's gaze remained fixed on Caroline. "Tell me, dear," she said softly, "if you did not mean to kill him, then why did someone else try to silence Mr. Lavington?" Caroline's sobs stilled abruptly. For a moment she simply stared at Miss Marple, true terror flickering across her face. Then slowly she shook her head. "I know I didn't. I didn't try to hurt him. Why would I? I had nothing to do with that." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Ah, and that, you see, is what's most interesting." Davis frowned. "What are you getting at, Miss Marple?" She turned to him with a small knowing smile. "You see, Inspector Caroline Gray did kill Sir Edmund, but I rather think someone else has been cleaning up after her." And that, she added, her tone, light but firm, "is far more interesting. Don't you think?" Davis swore under his breath. "So you're saying that someone else was invested in this cover-up?" Miss Marple confirmed. "Someone with influence, power, and most interestingly, someone who did not wish Sir Edmund's final painting to be seen. Caroline blinked. I thought it was over. I thought Miss Marple gave her a sympathetic look. I suspect, my dear, that you were not the only person who wished Sir Edmund dead. You were simply the first to act. Caroline's lips parted in horror, and somewhere beyond the storm-battered windows of Ravenscoft Manor, the true mastermind was still waiting in the dark, unseen, unknown, but not for much longer. Miss Marple had already begun setting her final trap, and she intended to catch the real puppet master behind it. All the art festival of St. Mary Me had always been an event of color and celebration of fine conversation and pleasant admiration. But this year, air carried a different weight, a subdued hush beneath the usual murmur of voices, a reverence that had not been there before. The unveiling of Edmund Sinclair's final painting was still the festival's crowning event. But now it was not merely about art. It was about truth. The grand hall, once brimming with eager anticipation, was now filled with something quieter, more somber. The villagers gathered in clusters, their discussions hushed, and edged with unease the scandal of the past weeks. The murder, the confessions, the hidden network of patrons who thrived on secrecy, had left an imprint upon them. Miss Marple moved through the hall with characteristic ease, watching, listening. The painting stood uncovered at the center of it, all its presence commanding even as it remained wordless. Sir Edmund's final creation, his unfinished masterpiece. It was beautiful, undeniably so. Bold strokes of crimson and deep cerulean wove through the canvas, clashing and blending in a way that was both unsettling and mesmerizing. But there in the center was the true revelation. The figure of a woman half formed her expression, one of anguish, her eyes shadowed with longing, outline gray. It was not a portrait of devotion, it was not a tribute, it was a painting of something fractured, a love that had not been kind, that had not been equal. Sir Edmund had captured the truth, and in doing so had signed his own death warrant near the entrance. Carol Grey was escorted out by 2 officers, her posture still poised, though her face betrayed exhaustion. The trial would come, the formalities of justice playing out as they must. But the village had already passed its judgment. Mrs. Pettigrew whispered behind her gloved hand to Mrs. Harper. Such a shame, really, I dare say. She could have made something of herself, if only she'd chosen another path. Mrs. Harper sniffed. Women in love do foolish things, and foolish things, my dear, do tend to get one into trouble. Inspector Davis approached Miss Marple, shaking his head. You were right about everything. Caroline killed Sir Edmund in a moment of desperation. But she wasn't the only one with something to hide. Miss Marple gave him a knowing smile. Indeed, the hidden network of collectors, those patrons who profited off secrecy and stolen treasures. I imagine they'll have a rather uncomfortable time ahead. Davis exhaled. It would seem that Sinclair had finally decided he wanted out, whether from the society itself, or from the clutches of someone within it. We'll never know. But his last painting, it was meant to expose something, wasn't it? Miss Marple glanced back at the canvas, tilting her head. Perhaps, or perhaps it was simply the truth of his own. Tangled. Artists do have a way of putting their emotions on the canvas, even when they don't intend to. Davis crossed his arms. And what of the others? Those who stood to gaze? Miss Marple's expression grew unreadable. Oh well, power has a way of protecting itself. Inspector, you may find that some doors remain curiously shut when you go knocking. Davis muttered something under his breath, but knew better than to argue outside the festival. Continued. Though the rye had softened, the string quartets played, but the music seemed less exuberant. Wine was poured, but in smaller measures. Sir Edmund Sinclair's name passed through the lips of the villagers, in half-whispers spoken with equal parts admiration and unease. Miss Marple stood near the flower arrangements that adorned the entrance, her gloved hands folded over her handbag. Tragedy is a peculiar thing, she mused aloud. Reverend Hughes, who had come to pay his respect, turned to her with a solemn nod. Indeed, the Lord teaches us that all things happen according to his plan. But even so, some events feel particularly cruel. Miss Marple smiled faintly. I rather think Sir Edmund would have appreciated the dramatics of it all. Artists do tend to be drawn to the tragic, don't they? Hugh sighed. And yet what remains? A name, a painting, a scandal. Perhaps, Miss Marple said softly. Or perhaps the lesson is in the aftermath, in how people choose to. Hughes gave her a long, thoughtful look, his sharp eyes searching for something in her expression. But in the end, he said nothing. There was no need. The truth had been laid bare, as it always was in the end. Outside, the festival lights burned low, their golden glow flickering against the darkened windows of St. Mary Mead, like embers clinging to life. The night was cool and still, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and the last whispers of revelry drifting through the quiet streets. Miss Marple took one final look at the painting, the masterpiece that would never be finished, the artist who would never paint again. Love, she thought, had not saved Caroline Gray, nor had it saved Sir Edmund Sinclair, but the truth had come to light, as it always did, cutting through deception like a blade through silk. With a soft sigh, she turned and stepped into the night. The case was closed, but St. Mary Mead was a village where secrets never truly stayed buried, and she suspected, with the certainty of one who had seen many such endings, that another mystery waited just around the corner. The days that followed were ones of quiet restoration. The festival had come to a close. The banners and bunting were carefully folded away, and the last of the visitors had boarded their trains back to London. Soon the whispers would fade, replaced by fresher gossip. Mrs. Petheridge's scandalous new gardener, the vicar's rather curious sermon, the latest mishap at the Women's Institute. Life in the village, with its comfortable rhythm of tea in the afternoons and chrysanthemums in the gardens, would return to normal. But for Miss Marple, the evening was not yet over. She sat in her small tidy sitting room, where the fire burned low, casting long shadows that danced across lace curtains. The air was still, save for the distant rustling of leaves outside, and the steady, deliberate ticking of the antique carriage clock on the mantel. For once she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. Her fingers rested lightly against the arm of her chair, her gaze unfocused as she considered all that had come to pass. Art, she mused, was much like human nature, beautiful, intricate, deceptive. It had the power to captivate, to inspire, to conceal. Sir Edmund Sinclair had been a man of brilliance, but also of blindness. He had painted the truth, yet he had never truly seen the people around him. He had surrounded himself with beauty, but he had failed to recognize the danger lurking in its shadow. And Caroline Gray, poor foolish Caroline, a woman who had spent her life chasing something just out of reach, love, validation, permanence. In the end, she had destroyed the very thing she cherished most. But the true villain of the piece had not been her alone. There were others, unseen hands that had woven a far greater deception, the hidden network of collectors, the shadowy figures who thrived on secrets and stolen works. They had not acted out of love or revenge, but out of something far colder, greed. They had sought to suppress the truth, not out of passion, but because the truth threatened their power. And they, Miss Marple knew, were not finished. Their influence would outlive this scandal, just as it had outlived many before. It was a sobering thought, one that settled in her mind like the last note of a song left unresolved. She glanced at the clock. The hands moved ever forward, unbothered by the weight of human folly. Time, she thought, was the great equalizer, the true detective, the one force no man or woman could outwit. It uncovered lies, revealed hidden truths, and in the end, judged all things with a quiet, impartial certainty. Sir Edmund's paintings would remain, his legacy intact. Despite his tragic end, the scandal would fade, names would be forgotten, new stories would take their place, and yet the secrets buried beneath the surface would not truly vanish. St. Mary Mead, for all its outward tranquility, would always have another mystery. A faint smile touched Miss Marple's lips. She reached for her knitting basket, her fingers moving with quiet efficiency. The fire crackled softly, the carriage clock ticked on, and outside, The village slumbered beneath the watchful gaze of the stars. Somewhere someone was keeping a secret, and one day, when the time was right, she would uncover it. With that thought, she settled comfortably in her chair, her needles clicking in time with the steady inevitable ticking of the clock. Miss Marple, after all, always had the last word.